In 1826, Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley, not content at having invented the entire genre of science fiction by writing Frankenstein, published the first recognized post-apocalyptic science fiction novel, The Last Man. While apocalyptic tales can be traced back to antiquity with famous fables like the Epic of Gilgamesh and Noah's Ark, Shelley brought the idea to the modern world, predicting a distant 21st century ravaged by pandemic disease, political turmoil, and a massive flood coinciding with a solar eclipse. It even ends with what would today be considered a post-apocalyptic cliché, where a lone survivor decides to wander the wasteland with his faithful canine companion. I'll talk more about Mary Shelley a bit later, but the earliest examples of a cinematic apocalypse arguably begin with the 1916 Danish film appropriately titled The End of the World. But the idea wouldn't hit the mainstream until 1933, the same year that King Kong was let loose on New York City. While Kong's rampage was a spectacle of its own that gave birth to the blockbuster, his destruction was relatively tame. A disaster to be sure, but not an apocalypse. What would hit the silver screen a few months later, however, was something altogether different, something audiences certainly weren't prepared to experience, and which dealt with some topics that might get this video on the wrong side of the YouTube algorithm.
All you'll ever be.
It's the end of the world! Earthquakes are ravishing the entire surface of the Earth, coastlines are sinking into the ocean, and massive tidal waves are destroying the very heart of civilization. Miriam-Webster survives this onslaught, believing his family to have perished, and makes a life for himself in a small cottage. When a woman, Claire, barely alive, washes ashore, he is forced into a battle to save her from bloodthirsty raiders and the savage man who wants to claim her for himself, while the two of them fall in love as they cling precariously to their shared humanity. Meanwhile, not far away, a scattered band of people are trying to rebuild, and among them are Martin's wife and children, still alive after all this time.
In 1928, a British accountant named Sidney Fowler Wright self-published Deluge, the novel that would make him famous. It was a massive bestseller in its day, received a lot of critical acclaim, and would eventually inspire the likes of John Wyndham and John Christopher, writers of such post-apocalyptic classics as The Day of the Triffids and The Death of Grass. Despite Deluge's popularity upon its publication, it would be a few years before Wright thought to option the film rights using his own adapted screenplay. In 1933, Deluge was purchased for $5,000, no small sum in those days, to be produced by the independent Admiral Productions on an eventual final budget of $171,000. Admiral opted not to use Wright's screenplay, instead giving it to writers Warren B. Duff and John F. Goodrich. And to direct, they hired the former MGM staffer Felix E. Feist. Feist was virtually unknown at the time, but he would go on to direct noirs like The Devil Thumbs a Ride and This Woman is Dangerous, as well as directing the cult sci-fi B-picture Donovan's Brain. The lead role of Martin is filled by character actor Sidney Blackmer, known at the time as a frequent supporting man in movies like The Lady Who Dared and From Hell to Heaven. Casting a familiar actor who doesn't look like a leading man lends the character a more down-to-earth, relatable, everyman quality that really works for the story being told. By the end of Blackmer's career in the early 70s, he had appeared in over 120 films, including High Society and Rosemary's Baby. The female lead, the athletic swimmer Claire, is played by then-it girl Peggy Shannon, who was no doubt an expensive borrow from Fox, which was grooming her to be one of the studio's biggest female stars. Shannon was a hard-working actress and fashion maven, but she quickly gained a reputation for being difficult to work with and for having struggles with alcohol that led to her untimely death in 1941. As for the final corner of the film's central love triangle, Martin's wife Helen, she is played by the silent-era beauty queen Lois Wilson, known for her roles in The Covered Wagon and 1926's The Great Gatsby. In the sound era, she would transition into more of a character actress, and when the television emerged, she transitioned once again into a soap opera star, appearing in multiple popular soaps, including the extremely long-running Guiding Light. Other notable actors include the ubiquitous bad boy actor Fred Kohler as Jeffson, the absurdly prolific Matt Moore as Tom, and Dr. Van Helsing himself, Edward Van Sloan, as this hapless professor who dies in New York during the first act after reassuring everyone that the apocalypse wasn't going to affect the East Coast. However, arguably the most important crew members for Deluge weren't the actors, but rather the special effects team. Ned Mann, who would later work on H.G. Wells' Apocalyptic Things to Come, Russell E. Lawson, a matte artist who would later work on Bride of Frankenstein among many other great films, and cinematographer William Billy Williams, who had previously worked on Dr. X and would later work on Around the World in 80 Days and Vertigo. Ned Mann's miniatures were especially impressive for the time, and many of the opening act's scenes of destruction, after the movie was bought by Republic Pictures, became stock footage that frequently pops up throughout the 30s and 40s. One of the shots used in the film is allegedly footage of a real California quake, though I'm not really sure which shot it is or if that's even true. Deluge released in theaters in August of 1933 to mostly positive reviews, and reportedly did very well at the box office, though predictably actual numbers are hard to come by. However, it was the last film produced by the short-lived Admiral Productions, with its founders moving into more mainstream roles within the industry. While Deluge was relatively big in its day, it faded into obscurity in the following decades, and was, for many years, thought to be a lost film, until a dubbed Italian print was unearthed by Forrest J. Ackerman in 1981, and then a superior French reprint, still with the original English-language soundtrack, was found in 2016. It has had a lasting legacy, though, inspiring whole swaths of disaster and post-apocalyptic cinema. Though not technically the first of its kind, it is usually credited as the original post-apocalyptic movie, and there can be no doubt a lot of subsequent films borrowed from it, either directly or indirectly. For example, one of its most memorable sequences, in which the Statue of Liberty is drowned by a rapidly rising tide, is recreated most famously in Roland Emmerich's The Day After Tomorrow. Hey, have you hit that like button yet? If not, I'd really appreciate it if you did. And if you really do like what I'm doing, please consider subscribing as well. If you want to support what I do even more, you can also check out my Patreon to get access to bonus content, vote on future topics, and more. I also have a bunch of other things to promote, like my book, my podcasts, my website, and my Discord server, which are all linked in the description below. With all that out of the way, let's move on. I've previously discussed my love of the pre-code era of Hollywood, where filmmakers were relatively free to express themselves however they saw fit, with no real censorship from on high. These movies weren't afraid to tackle difficult subject matter, and in retrospect, they often feel more mature and thematically dense than later movies that would be forced to follow the strict rules of the Hays Office or the MPAA. The pre-code era was a brief moment in which American cinema was at its freest, and proof, to me at least, that there is nothing more important in art than creative autonomy. And that brings me to Deluge, a movie that simply could not have been made even a year later than it was. The book it adapts ends with a harrowing personal dilemma, wherein our hero, Martin, has married Claire after the disaster because he believed his family to be gone, only to discover that his family is, in fact, still alive. He still loves the mother of his children, Helen, but he also loves Claire. The book and the movie diverge on a solution, with the book forcing our characters to adjust to a new reality where polygamy is acceptable, but with the movie going much darker, with a despondent Claire opting to take her last swim, so to speak. The irony of me having to choose my words carefully on these matters 90 years later speaks volumes about the puritanical censoriousness of our modern world, but I digress. This movie was made and released during the Great Depression, where whole communities were torn down by poverty and starvation, where morality was flexible due to the desperate struggle for survival. In both Deluge and the Depression, we can witness greed and avarice, plunder and, forced physical relations, confusion and hopelessness, betrayal and murder, all mixed together in a stew of horror that reflects a more brutal and unforgiving look at our fellow man. Of course, the book, which was written in the 20s and set in England, was more about British classism than anything else, which is probably why S. Fowler Wright, the writer, denounced the film after screening an incomplete version. He was upset they didn't use his script, and that they changed the core thematic ideas of his story. And while I can appreciate that reaction as a writer, I think the movie is far superior in that it feels more real. The book's ending is laughably neat, and its general tone is all over the place, whereas the movie feels like a cohesive vision that doesn't pull its punches. Post-apocalyptic fiction and disaster movies are compelling because they strip humanity down to its baser instincts, try to address that old philosophical question of whether humanity, stripped of civilization, is generally good or generally evil. I brought up Mary Shelley's The Last Man at the start of this video because she too was dealing with harrowing times, having lost her close friends, her husband, and 2 of her 3 children. The Last Man, in that context, was her way of reconciling a life overflowing with loss with the need to keep on living. Now, in Deluge, Martin is a hero who defeats the depraved Jeffson and helps restore some sense of order to the post-disaster world, but he fails to solve the moral conundrum of Claire, whose grisly fate ends the movie on a deeply disturbing note. The movie doesn't try to wrap things up neatly or make any grand conclusion about questions that can never truly be answered, which is why I say it feels more real, and also what separates it from many other disaster movies that try too hard to wish an answer into existence, or which sidestep such questions to begin with. For audiences in 1930s America, they never would have bought anything so sentimental, because this was a movie hitting very close to home. On the other hand, it did offer a pseudo-escape in that the world of Deluge was even worse than the world of the Great Depression. But that's how great speculative fiction works, by showing us something a little more extreme than reality in order to get us to think about the here and now. All of this is a roundabout way of saying that Deluge is a critical snapshot of America in desperate times, an enormously influential piece of cinema, and undeniably a sci-fi classic. And that's all for today, my fellow Earthlings. What's your favorite disaster movie? Let me know in the comments, and while you're there, double check that you've hit those like and subscribe buttons. Thank you for watching, and until next time, when we'll discuss the inverse of the final countdown, the first count up, this is the Unapologetic Geek, telling you to never be ashamed of what you love, as long as you're not hurting anything.
Oh, don't ask me any more of your silly questions. I don't know what it's all about any more than you do.
Bye.